Well, just a quick notice again before we get into the message. I mentioned all the Easter things this week. We'd love for you to be a part of those. Also, we mentioned it last week. We send out an email and a WhatsApp as well, but we have an AGM coming up in April on the 23rd, and I'm really hoping you can make it to that. Still actually trying to figure out a location, which is being a little harder because it would be really hard to have it here, even in another room, because the brass band will be practicing. But we'll keep you posted on that. But it'll be a really good one. I know AGMs aren't everybody's favorite thing, but ours are fun and exciting. So if you can be a part of that, please do. So today, obviously, is Palm Sunday. It marks the beginning of Holy Week, leading up to Good Friday and, of course, Easter next Sunday. And as we look at the passage today that we're going to look at, Jesus this is near the end of his life. He's been ministering throughout Judea and now comes to focus on Jerusalem and the temple. And in his final week before being arrested and executed on the cross. So in that tradition, just keeping in mind this passage, we're going to look not only at the triumphal entry, but the way Matthew brings in two other really crazy stories that kind of make us wonder, what is Jesus doing? So I'm excited for us to unpack that. So Jane, you want to come up? And we're going to read Matthew 21, verses 1 through 22.
Okay, so Matthew 21, beginning in verse 1. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, The Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest. And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, Who is this? And the crowd said, This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, It is written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, Do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, Yes, have you never read? Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise. And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. In the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, May no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. When the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, How did the fig tree wither at once? And Jesus answered them, Truly, I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, Be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. May God bless the reading of his word.
Right. So there's interesting things going in here. This is Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem, as we know. It's a big scene. The palm leaves that we had today, you see that where that comes from. And entrances matter, don't they? I was thinking about this as I was pondering this story. How you enter, like a room or maybe an online thing with Zoom. I was thinking of this story that happened to me just in the early days of COVID, when we were all getting used to doing online stuff, right? And I in my role in the U.S., one of the things I did in ministry is I ran a 2-year kind of undergrad Bible institute. So it'd be like an associate's level, did a lot of the teaching and development oversight. And so we moved our classes, a lot of them onto online. And so I was doing these over Zoom. But then we went into, remember hybrid services or any hybrid everything, where it's half online, half in person? We were at that point, and everyone was still discovering Zoom. And so there was a student in my class. There was probably 20, 25 students. And there was a student, a few of them were online, and a lot were in person, and we were socially distanced. Oh, I don't miss those days. Right? And we were all spread out. And it was, this one guy came on a little late. He was driving, but he didn't want to miss the lecture. But I was already into the lecture, so he was a bit late, and he was driving. And this is before we were really good at making sure we're muted before we come on, right? I'll never forget this. This was quite a... and so I'm lecturing, and because it was a classroom, it was on the screen and in the sound system in the room, and all the other people that were on Zoom as well, right? And so, and everyone's listening to me, and he comes on thinking he's muted. And I remember he's driving, and he didn't want to miss the lecture, but he logs in, and he's on his phone, and it's that awkward angle from a car, which nobody should ever do that, but it's what he was doing. And as he entered the Zoom class, what happened was completely unexpected. All you heard, and I'm sorry, I won't repeat what he said at all, was a tirade of expletives. I mean, it would have made Quentin Tarantino blush. It was unbelievable, and it just kept going. And I didn't know what to do, right? Because it was over there. The system was back there. No one was manning it. It was projecting it onto the wall. There's nothing I could do. And to make it worse, somebody had apparently cut him off, and he, and almost caused an accident. And he was just unleashing, and he was, you would say beeping the horn, right? We'd say honking in the U.S. He's pounding on his steering wheel, and just a tirade of expletives. And there's not much I could do. This was his entrance into the classroom, by the way. And to make matters worse, his wife was sitting in the room. She was in person in the room. And to even make it more awkward, she was our kid's doctor. So we knew these people well. And so the look on her face, the whole moment, the whole entrance into the class, and then the moment when he realized he wasn't muted, and that we all heard the whole thing, the stuttered apologies and all of that. It was quite an entrance. One I will never forget. And the looks on people's faces, how do you recover from that, right? But he did. I felt bad for the poor guy. We all have bad days. We've all lost it a few times. That was pretty impressive. But Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem is kind of like this, not in the same way, obviously, but it was completely different than what people were expecting. It was completely shocking, and what he did was shocking. And we know this because the very crowds that cry Hosanna, as we read in the passage here, a few days later are yelling, crucify, aren't they? The very ones. At least many of them would have been. And those realities still challenge us today. Jesus often comes into our lives in ways we don't expect, shaking up things in our lives that need to change, refocusing on the things that truly matter, calling us into a whole new way of life. So what can we learn from this king on a donkey, on a colt? His seemingly crazy actions in the temple, right? There's lots of thoughts about what is this all about in the temple, and why does he get so mad at a fig tree? What is this about? Why is this the way Matthew portrays Jesus' entrance? Isn't that interesting? We often just stop when we read this story we stop at the Hosanna part, and we don't tie in these other parts. But in the text, what we're supposed to see is this whole thing. This is Jesus' entrance into the city of Jerusalem. And he's doing some pretty shocking things. So as we see from the text, they approach Jerusalem, he and his disciples from Bethany. I have a map there if you want to put that up for a second, then we'll come back to the text. Right there. So Bethany is about 1.5 mile journey going around the Mount of Olives would be the normal route. Okay? And as they're going, as we see in the passage, they go through Bethphage, which, by the way, this is interesting, and you'll see maybe why this comes into it. But the name Bethphage means house of the unripe fig. Isn't that interesting? House of the unripe fig. That should be telling, right? Okay, and then they come into the city, either through the Shoshan Gate, which is right there, that goes right into the court of the Gentiles, and then you have the Gate Beautiful and all that. Or he would have come down here to the Huldah Gates. We don't know for sure exactly, but they come in from this east side, and this is where the people are laying their cloaks. And remember, their cloaks would have been this would have been their coat, their blanket, their everything, and most people would only have had one, right? And so they're laying them on the ground, and those who don't are cutting palm leaves and laying them to make the path smooth. It was a way of honor, of honoring someone as they come into the city. And these kinds of expressions were common with leaders and warriors who would come into a city triumphantly. So they would see this happen all the time. I'm sure Pilate, the local governor, right, he would have come in like this from time to time. And there would be all this kind of parade. That's where we get parades from. This would have been quite common, right? And so they're honoring Jesus, this prophet, this miracle worker, this teacher that they've heard about, to come into the city, and they're crying out to him. Now notice before they come, Jesus says, go find this donkey tied there with her colt, which is the young donkey, right? Which is really interesting. Mark's gospel doesn't pay attention to the two animals, but Matthew draws attention to two. And he says, untie them and bring them to him. And if someone asks you, say the Lord needs them, and he'll bring it back, right? That's what's happening. Now, what's interesting here is this is a thing that people would do. They would, did they call it commandeering here? In the U.S., like police can commandeer your vehicle, right? And so that's kind of what's happening. It's like the Lord needs this. And so, okay, this is a yes, and then he'll make sure he gets it back to you, right? So this is clearly something important. And then Matthew takes this moment to kind of explain what's happening, to fulfill the prophecy, particularly the one in Zechariah 9, which is a picture of a humble king, but a king at peace. In fact, many times when a king would come into a city on a donkey, yes, it was considered humble, but it was often a sign of peace, not war, instead of a horse. If they were on a horse, it would be the sign of war. Does that make sense? Okay, and so Zechariah promises this. It could be a sign of victory, but a sign of peace. And then it was also in their minds from about 150 years before this, before Jesus, in the period of the Maccabees. I won't go into all of that, but there had been a period of time where the Jews had won their freedom from the Syrophoenician Greeks, and they had won a little bit of period where the kingdom of Judea was independent and not under a power until the Romans came. There was just this little window, and that period is where we get Hanukkah from, by the way, if you know any of that stuff. It doesn't matter, but in that period, there would have been the waving of palm branches to talk about the victory that had been won. Okay, so this was a symbol that people knew and was very much tied to the idea of Hosanna, save us, rescue us, okay? And so they do exactly as Jesus says, and they put their cloaks on the colt and donkey. And what's interesting about the donkey and the colt, is that the way you train a young donkey is by tethering it to its mother, right? And so that's the reason this is done this way. And so it fulfills prophecy, but there's a beautiful picture there of that kind of what Jesus is even doing with his disciples. He's showing them, he's showing us what kind of community life is like. But then it says a very large crowd, they lay the branches down, and then they proclaim, this is from Psalm 118, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest heaven, as I read at the beginning of worship today. And Hosanna means save me, rescue me, help me. It's a desperate cry. Lord, rescue me. It's without a doubt, though, a kingly request. It's a messianic cry. Rescue us, the Messiah, the chosen one. Rescue us from oppression. And in this case, it would be from Roman rule. And that's what they're expecting. They're hoping this miracle worker they've been hearing about has come to announce his kingship. But here's the interesting thing. One of the first things that we don't notice is where Jesus goes first. If you were a king and you were coming into the community to announce your authority, your victory, your position, where would you go? You can go back to that map for a second. I'm sorry, I might make you bounce around a bit today. So the Hasmonean palace, this is where Herod would have been, right there. This is where Jesus would have been expected to go, right? Because he is coming to announce his kingship. And Herod would recognize the danger, and we know of Herod's response later, of Jesus coming into this. It's considered a threat. But he doesn't come there. So he stops at the temple. That would not be where a king would first go. King would go to the palace. Does that make sense? You see, so already Jesus is he's a humble sign of peace. He's coming into the temple and not the palace. So he's already kind of like, you can imagine them, they're like, this is high, we don't know this, but I wonder if they kind of paved the road and then he takes the turn towards the temple. And they're kind of like, no, this way, Jesus, you're supposed to go. We don't know for sure. That's just me, thinking about it. But there would have been the expectation that this is where he would go, right? So he goes right into the courts, the court of the Gentiles. We can go to that picture of the temple. And this is this big area around the central temple complex, right? And this area, he comes into that area, and he does what's unexpected. He drives out those buying and selling, overturns the tables and benches of those selling doves. And in John's gospel, it says he even fashions something like a whip, like a cord. And he doesn't strike the people, but he drives them out. And it's a really, really shocking move. No one's supposed to go, oh, that's normal, right? This is like, no, why is Jesus doing this? He should be driving out the Romans. Does that make sense? But he's not. He's going right into the temple, and he's driving out the money changers and those selling for sacrifice. And I just want to give us a little context there in this, because it was expected that there would be people who would sell the animals at the temple or around the temple for those who would come for sacrifice that either couldn't afford it. That was in Leviticus, it talks about those who could use doves because they didn't have the livestock or the money. It was a way to let the poor come to offer and worship. Does that make sense? Okay, and so this was normal and expected. There would have been some of this there, but not in the court of Gentiles, and I'll explain in a second. So that part in itself isn't necessarily bad. And also those who came from faraway lands, it would be very hard for them to bring their animals, so they would come and buy suitable animals for the sacrifice, right? So that was somewhat expected. But Jesus is driving them out of the court of the Gentiles, and he's saying, you have made this a den of robbers. This is meant to be a house of prayer. He's quoting Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7. Isaiah 56 this is a house of prayer, but it's really important for what? All nations. Okay? This is a house of prayer. And so the court of Gentiles, what that space was supposed to be for, was for the non-Jews, the outsiders, to be able to come and pray and worship Yahweh. And so what it's become is the people who were supposed to be able to come and experience God's presence, even if they were outside of the tribe of Israel, the people of Israel, that space was now invaded by the money changers. And that was the other thing, is they had to change to the temple shekel as opposed to the other. And so and Jesus drives them out. There is some corruption. We know from other writers that these temple money changers would charge exorbitant, exchange rates and rob people, basically. And then the doves that were meant to be cheap, to make it very easy for the poor, they would charge more, right? And so Jesus is addressing that injustice. But he's also addressing the injustice that is keeping the nations out. Does that make sense? The nations are supposed to be able to come And Jesus is saying, no, this is the place of prayer. Not to pray for the nations, but for the nations to come and pray. Does that make sense? For the people to come and see the goodness of God. If you go back and look at David, David established worship and he wanted it to be a light to the nations. Right? He wanted the nations to come and see the worship of Yahweh. And Jesus is saying, he's doing a very David thing, saying that's what this is supposed to be about. And when he calls them robbers, quoting from Jeremiah, the word is robber carries the wrong idea for us a little bit of thief. Like they're just those who are robbing the money. But these are brigands. The word is more brigand. It's the same word we use for Barabbas. These are the insurrectionists, the plotters, the politicians. Isn't that interesting? So Jesus, nowadays, the politicians rings a little, and Jesus is driving them out. You're a den of robbers. You're using the place for the nations to come to experience the presence of God, and you're using it for a place to, one, profit and make money. Gosh, that's convicting. And then two, a place to plot. Your plots. And in doing that, you're keeping the people, the very people who need to come into the presence of God from being able to come into the presence of God. You're not operating as this was intended to operate. That's why Jesus is so upset. Does that make sense? But Matthew shows this one verse. That very bottom one, 14. The blind, so he drives them out. He's cleansed the temple. And this little throwaway verse, but I want you to see what's happening here. Verse 14. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. The very thing that the temple was meant for, Jesus is now doing. He drives out, he cleanses it. He said, this is what this is for. And then the very people who needed help are coming in and being healed. And in a sense, Jesus is demonstrating this very important point that we know. He is the true temple. Does that make sense? The true temple is him. And they come to him and they are healed. That's beautiful, isn't it? This restoration of that. So this picture, again, is that of him being the true temple. And then this next thing that happens, okay? When the chief priests and teachers see this, they're upset, right? The wonderful things he's doing. And then what they see is the children shouting in the temple courts. And what are they shouting? Hosanna to the Son of David. Save me to the Son of David. That's a messianic term. They're calling Jesus the King. And they're not happy, right? They were indignant. They're not just a little upset. They're furious. Because Jesus has just rocked the whole system. Do you see that? Do you see why this is like... If you put yourself in a Jewish person's time, he's not doing anything anybody thinks he should do. But what he's actually doing is restoring the temple in himself. He himself is that. That's beautiful. Okay? And then yes, Jesus replied, have you never read, and this is a quote from Psalm 8, I believe, right, where he says, Psalm 8, have you never read from the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth praise. This statement is profound because not only are the children would have been outcast in themselves. They were meant to be quiet. They weren't to talk. They weren't to be involved. Does that make sense? In that society, in particular, they were not to be a part of anything. You weren't really something until you were 12, at least. And that was where you started to become an adult. And so, if you were younger than that, and even the way they treated infants in the ancient world, we won't even get into that, especially in Roman society. But Jesus is quoting Psalm 8, but if you notice what he's saying with this about the lips of the infants from Psalm 8 and the children, is that the ones who are the weakest are the ones who actually get it. Does that make sense? The simple get it. The wise ones don't have a clue what's going on. The smart ones, the educated ones, they don't know, but the children know. I just think that's beautiful. And we see that all the time with Jesus, where he points this kind of thing out, right? They get it, you don't get it. And even more than that, we'll just unpack that sentence a little bit. Lord, you, Lord, have called forth your praise. Who's Jesus associating himself with? God. I mean, when people say that the Bible doesn't proclaim, the New Testament doesn't proclaim Jesus as God, they've not really read the New Testament well. It's very clear multiple times that Jesus associates himself as God, as we would use the word Trinity, but he is clearly associating himself with that. They're not happy by this. We know these statements are the things, and what Jesus says and does about the temple are the things that get him in trouble this coming week, right? Okay? Are you tracking with me? I know there's a lot of background, but I hope it's helping us understand it. Jesus leaves the city and goes back to Bethany, probably back through that place through Bethpage, which means what? Anyone remember?
Unripe fig.
What's that?
Unripe fig.
Unripe fig, the house of the unripe fig, right? But he sees it and it has no fruit. It's not functioning in its purpose. Now, Jesus cursing the fig tree and it withering up. I mean, I've heard all sorts of stuff about this. I've heard that this is Jesus getting hangry, right? He's hungry and he sees it and he needs to eat something and it's not there and he's kind of having a bad day. And so he's like, yeah. But I mean, I've heard this preached, that Jesus is kind of having a weak moment and he's like, you know what? I'm just going to let that fig tree have it. Can you imagine that this is like Jesus is kind of, like this is what he does when he's mad. He causes trees to wither. Does that make any sense? Right? But it withers and the disciples are shocked. It's unexpected. What is Jesus doing? Why is this poor fig tree the target of Jesus' hangry attack? Is that really what's going on, right? But Jesus then says something very interesting and a couple verses that are misused a lot. But Jesus replied, truly I tell you, if you have faith and no doubt, not only can you do what was done to this fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and it will be done. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. So is Jesus saying, hey, disciples, if you have faith and you're hungry and a tree doesn't have fruit, you can curse the tree? Is that what Jesus is getting at here? Like, you go to the store, you go to a restaurant, and they don't have what you want, and then you get mad and you curse them. And is that what Jesus is saying here? Absolutely not. And worse, as some people teach, this passage is sometimes used to say, you know what, you can, as long as you have enough faith, if you pray just hard enough, God will give you whatever you want. Is that what Jesus is getting at? Absolutely not. Now, it doesn't mean we can't pray bold prayers, but what Jesus is saying here has everything to do with what he's doing about the temple. Does that make sense? I'll unpack this a little bit. This whole section preceding the whole thing where the priests and Pharisees, we won't go through it for time's sake, but by what they're questioning Jesus' authority and Jesus' entrance, the cleansing of the temple, the healing, the children proclaiming who he is, the cursing of the fig tree, the questioning of authority. All these things are to help us understand exactly who Jesus is and what he's come to do. The stories of, and I called this sermon, the king, the temple, and the tree. Right? Because these things point to the fulfillment of all the messianic hopes of Israel, but in ways they would never have expected. So I want you to catch this. Matthew is showing us that Jesus is the promised prophet, priest, and king. And the activities of this final week will clarify how Jesus fulfills the various prophesied roles of the anticipated Messiah, the chosen one, the anointed one. So he's all of these amazing prophecies in the Old Testament, hopes and ideas, were seen in various lights. Different people had different interpretations of this. We have all these different other kind of rise-ups throughout this period of time who claim to be these messiahs. None of them do we know of today. I mean, most people don't, unless you've studied history. You would not know that there were these other uprisings, people who tried to start armies, tried to start movements, and claimed to be a Messiah, but none of them did anything close or had any kind of impact like Jesus. Jesus comes instead as a humble servant king who functions like a priest, right? He comes in on the donkey, but he functions like a priest, cleansing and healing, right? And then with the fig tree, he proclaims justice like an Old Testament prophet. And if you read the Old Testament prophets, they use little illustrations like this. Like Ezekiel does some weird stuff, like cooking food over dung, right? Like I'm glad God hasn't called me to do that one. Anyone else okay with that? and actually, the first request was even worse. Ezekiel's like, can we lighten this up just a little bit? We won't get into that. Right? We have a lot of examples like this where the Old Testament prophets do these wild things that become a lesson, a point, an object lesson as to what is really happening. And that's what's happening with the fig tree, okay? So since Judaism saw the messianic roles of prophet, priest, and king as fulfilled by different individuals, by and large, they didn't see these being these being one person, these three roles, okay? But a person who embodies all three would need to be absolutely extraordinary. That would be something unheard of, unexpected, shocking. And yet in Jesus' entrance into the city, and the first things he does, these things are immediately made clear to someone who knew what to look for. Does that make sense? So that Jesus is rocking all the boats. He's shaking up everything. So when it says the city is stirred, it's talking about people talking, but it's an interesting word because some of your translations it'll say the city is shaken. But there's a kind of shaking that's happening in a spiritual sense that Jesus is doing in the community. Does that make sense? He enters Jerusalem as the king, not to establish the monarchy, but to bring peace between God and humanity, to bring forgiveness of sins among humans through his own death. Right? He enters Jerusalem as a king like that. Then he clears the temple, not simply to restore the institutional and ethical integrity of the whole thing, right? But to announce that he's the priest to offer the final sacrifice, the ultimate one where there will be no more need for these animal sacrifices, and instead you will come into the presence of God and find forgiveness and healing and wholeness, right? And then he pronounces judgment on the temple and on Israel, something that's hard for us to think about, like the prophets of the Old Testament, not simply to restore order, but to function as the prophet who proclaims the promises of God and the fullness of God, not only to his disciples, but to the whole nation and beyond. So Jesus comes in shocking and unexpected ways. He's not just the warrior king, he comes as a humble king. His overcoming power is not in armies, but in the fact that he will deal with the prince of lies himself and conquer sin and death with his own death. He's going far deeper than any expectations or hopes could even imagine, right? I don't know about you, it's powerful. He's not just the nice minister or priest, but the one who brings cleansing and healing, right? He's not just a great preacher and teacher, but the very voice of God who brings about justice. And Jesus declares in the events of the temple, the cursing of the fig tree, and the parables that come after this, which are brutal. If you know this section, Jesus says some really hard things in the chapters ahead, in this week ahead. And I provided for you a list of scriptures to read this week to kind of walk through the week. And take it if you want. I mean, it's for you to take, but read through that this week and ponder the things that Jesus has done and what he faced. This was a wild week. It wasn't just a few church services. I mean, Jesus was shaking up everything, right? There's a lot going on. A whole new system was about to begin. And it would happen through Jesus' death and resurrection. It would not just change Jerusalem, but all of history and humanity. I love how one scholar put it, and I don't always quote scholars because I know sometimes they use difficult language, but he said this: the mission at this moment, the mission now becomes centrifugal, right? So going out, instead of centripetal, going in, right? This means that instead of the Gentiles coming to Israel to hear God's message, Jesus' disciples and followers are to go to all the nations with the gospel of the kingdom of heaven to make more disciples and more disciples and more disciples. From going in, being centered in one place, to now the very presence of healing that we see is now meant to go out. Does that make sense? That's beautiful. Those who follow Christ will now be living temples, fruit-bearing temples, through which the nations are healed, forgiven, and brought into communion with God through Christ and empowered by the Spirit. The temple was a reference point for God's presence. But when Jesus says you can pray and ask this mountain to move, by the way, that's a hyperbole. It's a way we'd say, oh, there were millions of people there when maybe there were 40, right? If somebody, we use phrases like this to show the intensity of something. So you would say, oh, that's something impossible. A way of referring to it would be moving a mountain, that mountain. But even more than that, when Jesus says this, he most likely would have been just past that corner. There's scholars who debate whether he's talking about the Mount of Olives or whether he's talking about the Temple Mount. Both would have been in view, and so he could have been kind of referring to both. I lean towards the temple because it makes sense, because he's brought this judgment on what's happening there. Does that make sense? And so what he's saying, these people would have seen in their lifetime not only that Jesus, the veil would tear, and then the need for sacrifices would cease, because the one perfect sacrifice was made in Jesus for us all. Right? But even more than that, within a few decades of this happening, of Jesus, the city of Jerusalem and the temple itself would be leveled. It would come crashing down. The very warnings that Jesus gives in the chapters that follow speak of them. So those who would have read Matthew, even in just decades after this, would be seeing this fulfilled in more ways than one. Does that make sense? Okay? And this fig tree thing was for the disciples as a picture of that reality. It's not Jesus having a bad moment and getting mad at a tree. Right? Does that make sense? It's a prophetic statement of when the temple was not functioning as it should. And there's nothing new. If you've read the Old Testament, if you've read any of the Old Testament prophets, they say the same thing. They say the same thing over and over again. Your lips praise me. I think it's in Micah multiple times. You sing your songs, you bring your sacrifices, and your hearts are far from me. I want nothing to do with it. That's God speaking, right? And because the twisting of this, of what we do in ourselves instead of in the Lord. So basically when he's talking about this mountain, what seemed impossible, that this oppressive system couldn't be moved, was moved right before their eyes. Does that make sense? And so pray this way. God can move. You think the Romans are in charge? Doesn't the way of Jesus say, you think that mountain is the thing that's going to, control your life? No. God's going to deal with that. Does that make sense? We can trust in the impossible. And it's not to say we can't pray bold prayers, but those bold prayers have to be in line with who he is and his will, right? So we can see in this passage the humble king is victorious. The priest cleanses and heals and makes space for the broken and the outcast to be cleansed and healed. And the prophet calls out against the unjust systems that claim to be in God's will but are not. Gosh, nowadays, I think we need that, right? These impossible things happen right before their eyes and happen for our lives as well. So Holy Week puts all this at the forefront. We're forced to face the reality of who Jesus is, what he's done, and what that means for humanity and all creation. He's not just king. He's not just priest. He's not just prophet. He's all three and more, right? He's truly the only one to whom we can say Hosanna. No one else can we say, save me. He's the only one who can save us. So as we reflect on this passage and throughout this week of Holy Week, I want to just close by looking at the center of this story with a couple thoughts. The center of the story is the cleansing of the temple and the healing and the children. And the priests don't get it, the Pharisees don't get it, the Roman authorities don't get it, the children get it. Right? They're the ones who get it. Save us, Son of David. That's what they're crying out. Faith like children. We talk about that a lot. Childlike faith. I did some research on this, and a psychologist named Paul Bloom at Yale, he has studied this reality that children have a natural bent towards God. Like, they have a natural bent towards God. He notes that there's even if they're not surrounded by evidence of God, the children in every culture have a concept of God that's natural to them. Isn't that interesting? He says, when children are directly asked about the origin of animals and people, they tend to prefer explanations that involve an intentional creator, even if the adults who raise them do not. Justin Barrett at Oxford University reported something similar. He said, scientific evidence has shown that built into the natural development of children's minds is a predisposition to see the natural world as designed and purposeful, and that some kind of intelligent being is behind that purpose. They're just wired that way. He goes on, even if a group of children were put on an island and they raised themselves, he adds, I think they would believe in God. And then he says, it appears that we have to be educated out of the knowledge of God by our systems in this world. Not interesting? That's an interesting statement. And as an example of that, they mention this other researcher in this that studies spirituality in young children. And she finds, her name's Sophia Cavalletti, and she finds that children often have an amazing perception that far surpasses what they've already been taught. Okay? One 3-year-old girl is an example, raised in an atheist family with no church contact at all, no Bible in the home, asked her father, where did the world come from? And he replied, in what would be expected in such a home, right? It was just a matter of chance, and things collided just right, and the perfect, it just randomly happened, and we're all here, right? That whole answer. And not the why or anything, but just this is why. And then he said, he did add to it, he said, there are some people who say that it all comes from a very powerful being that we can't see, and they call him God. And the response of the girl is very telling. The daughter jumps for joy, dancing around the room and saying, I knew what you told me wasn't true. It's him, it's him. Isn't that beautiful? I wonder if we opened our lives when we think of the triumphal entry and our hearts to see the wonder of Jesus again. That shocking reality of who Jesus is, how different he is than us. Like the eyes of children who knew what the most wise and educated didn't know. The humble king, the healing priest, and the just prophet. He's the only one we can cry Hosanna, because he's the only one who can save. Can I share one more quick story? And then we'll wrap up. This is from the book by Justin Brierley. Do you guys know who he is? The Unbelievable podcast. He's with Premier Christianity. He's an apologist, writes books down in London, down in England. In his book, Unbelievable, he shares a story of a lady named Jennifer Fulwiler, who grew up in a loving family here in the UK, but one in which religion was painted as clearly false. And she says that she never remembers a time when she believed in God as a child. Like, this is the way she was raised, on a diet of science and reason, evidence-based rational thought. Her bedtime reading was even Carl Sagan's astronomy book, Cosmos, right? Okay, this is her background. From a young age, she knew that the world ran according to all these scientific facts and laws, and that science, and I'm not anti-science, by the way. Science is a good thing. Science shows us a lot of things, right? But it doesn't tell us everything. But this was her mindset. This was the way of understanding everything. And she remained happy in this through her adult life. She was a perfectly happy atheist, using her words, right? However, shortly after the birth of her first child, she experienced a dramatic shift in her thinking, and she describes it this way, and I just want to quote it. She says, I looked down and thought, what is this baby? And I thought, well, from a pure atheist perspective, it's a randomly evolved collection of chemical reactions and cells, right? And I realized that if that's true, then all the love I feel for him is nothing more than chemical reactions in my brain. And I looked down at him and I thought, that's not true. It's not the truth. The moment was a turning point for the young mother, one which would eventually lead her to Christian faith. This is Justin Brierley talking. I described in her book called Something Other Than God. Something had finally clicked for Jennifer. The scientific explanation, she'd grown up weren't enough to explain the totality of what she was experiencing in the bond with her child. All of her knowledge of science couldn't explain the actual experience of real, fully fledged love. I like that. That's what Jesus says. When we look at him as he enters the city, as we think on it, the humble king we didn't expect, the true temple where we're healed, and the prophet who calls us to bear fruit. The invitation is really clear. Come to him, be cleansed by him, abide in him, and let your life become what the fig tree was meant to be, right? A life full of fruit, rooted in faith, and alive in the presence of God. Amen. I'll have us stand if we could, and we're going to pray and close in a last song here.